Welcome to the Dr. Harmony channel, where we dive deep into the most heart-wrenching and transformative stories of human resilience and justice. Today, I am bringing you a tale that will make your blood boil before it makes your heart soar. A story of a woman who was treated like dirt beneath the feet of those who should have loved her, only to rise from the ashes of betrayal. Have you ever been told you weren't enough because of the color of your skin or the balance in your bank account? Elena was a 36-year-old woman who lived that nightmare every single day. She was married into a family of gold-plated hearts and leaden souls, people who saw her beauty as a flaw and her humble beginnings as a stain on their prestigious lineage. They called her the Dark Shadow, a cruel nickname for a woman whose only crime was loving a man who didn't deserve her. But what happens when the person you've pushed into a corner finally finds the door? This isn't just a story of survival, it's a masterclass in the cold, calculated art of reclaiming one's soul. Stay tuned as we unravel the life of Elena, the woman who disappeared a victim and returned a queen, ready to dismantle the empire of the man who thought he owned her. This is a journey of betrayal, a complex web of family deception, and a final act of independence that no one saw coming. Elena sat at the far end of the long, mahogany dining table, her hands trembling slightly as she held her silver fork. Across from her sat Mrs. Sterling, her mother-in-law, a woman whose skin was as pale and cold as the pearls around her neck. The room smelled of expensive roast lamb and the suffocating scent of lilies, but for Elena, it felt like a tomb. You know, Julian, Mrs. Sterling said, her voice cutting through the silence like a dull blade. I saw the daughter of the Henderson family today, such a radiant girl. Fair, refined, and from a family that actually contributed something to society. It's a shame some people choose to bring shadows into a house that was meant for light. Julian, Elena's husband, didn't even look up from his plate. He simply grunted in agreement, sipping his vintage wine as if his wife wasn't sitting right there, absorbing every poisonous word. Elena was 36, an age where she should have been at the peak of her confidence, yet here she was, feeling like a frightened child. Her dark skin, which her father had always told her was like polished ebony, was treated as a badge of shame in this house. The Sterlings were old money, or so they claimed, and they never let a day go by without reminding Elena that she came from a dusty village with no name. The verbal abuse was a daily ritual. They mocked her clothes, her accent, and the way she worked 2 jobs just to send money back to her sick mother. To Julian, she wasn't a partner. She was a trophy he had grown tired of looking at, a charity project he regretted starting. He had married her in a fleeting moment of rebellion against his parents, but that spark had long since turned into resentment. He began to parrot his mother's insults, calling her peasant and worthless whenever she failed to meet his impossible standards. The breaking point didn't come with a scream, but with a whisper. One rainy Tuesday, Elena walked past Julian's home office and heard him laughing with his brother. The dark one? Oh, she's just the housekeeper I happen to sleep with, Julian chuckled. Mother is right. She's an eyesore. I'm just waiting for the right moment to toss her back to the mud she crawled out of. I've already started moving the assets into a private account. She won't get a dime when I'm done with her. Elena felt the world tilt. The man she had sacrificed her youth for, the man she had cared for through his own failures, was planning to discard her like trash. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up years ago, replaced by a cold, hard stone in her chest. She realized then that love was a luxury she could no longer afford. If they wanted a villain, she would give them a ghost. That night, while the house was silent and the Sterlings slept in their silk sheets, Elena packed a single small bag. She didn't take the jewelry Julian had bought to civilize her, nor the designer dresses that felt like straitjackets. She took her passport, the meager savings she had hidden in a floorboard, and a photograph of her mother. She looked at the grand Sterling mansion one last time, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn. She wasn't just leaving a marriage, she was escaping a prison. She knew they would look for her, but not because they missed her, only because they hated losing control. As she stepped into the taxi, she felt a strange sensation, the weight of the Sterling name falling off her shoulders. She was 36, broke and alone, but for the first time in a decade, she was Elena again. She disappeared into the city lights, leaving behind a note on the pillow that simply read, "The shadow is gone. Good luck finding the light." The first few months were a blur of cheap motels and grueling shifts at a diner. Elena changed her name, her hair, and her mindset. She realized that to beat people like the Sterlings, she couldn't just work hard, she had to work smart. She used her savings to enroll in a crash course for digital forensics and international finance. It turned out that the uneducated village girl had a mind like a steel trap. While Julian was busy spending his family's dwindling fortune on fast cars and faster women, Elena was learning how money moved in the shadows. She worked 18-hour days, fueled by the memory of Mrs. Sterling's smirk and Julian's laughter. She met a mentor, an older man who had been cheated by people exactly like the Sterlings, and he taught her the one thing the elite feared more than anything, someone who knew their secrets. She spent 3 years building a new identity, a woman of mystery and immense digital wealth. She wasn't the dark shadow anymore. She was the architect of her own destiny, and she was finally ready to go home. Elena's transformation was not just physical, it was a total recalibration of her soul. While the Sterlings assumed she had crawled back to her village to live in squalor, she was actually navigating the high-stakes world of corporate intelligence. She had spent 3 years meticulously studying the Sterling family's business empire, a crumbling structure held together by vanity and predatory loans. Julian had always been arrogant, believing his family's legacy was untouchable, but Elena saw the cracks. She saw the tax evasions, the offshore accounts used to hide gambling debts, and the sheer incompetence that Julian masked with expensive suits. She began to plant seeds of doubt in the market, acting as an anonymous consultant. Every move she made was calculated to draw them into a trap of their own greed. She knew Julian was looking for a new investment to save the family's failing real estate firm, and she was more than happy to provide him with one. She created a shell company, Ebony and Ivory Holdings, a name that was a private jab at their past insults, and positioned herself as the representative of a mysterious foreign billionaire looking to pour money into the city. In the 4th year of her disappearance, Elena decided it was time to make her presence felt. She didn't return as the submissive wife, she returned as the predator. She rented a penthouse overlooking the very district where Julian operated, watching him through high-powered binoculars as he walked into his office, looking older and more stressed than she remembered. The Sterlings were desperate. Their prestige was a hollow shell, and their creditors were starting to knock on the heavy oak doors of their mansion. Elena sent her first invitation a formal request for a meeting to discuss a strategic partnership. She used an intermediary, a sharp-tongued lawyer, who kept her identity strictly confidential. When Julian received the letter, he saw it as a lifeline. He didn't realize it was a noose. He spent a week preparing, bragging to his mother that the Sterling name still carried weight, unaware that the person holding the pen across the table was the woman he had called a housekeeper. The day of the meeting arrived. Elena dressed in a bespoke suit of deep emerald green, her hair styled in a sophisticated sharp bob. She wore no jewelry except for a single, dark pearl, a reminder of the dark shadow she once was. When she walked into the high-end restaurant's private room, Julian was already there, checking his gold watch. He looked up, and for a split second, his face went pale. He didn't recognize her immediately, but the eyes, those deep, haunting eyes, triggered a primal fear in his gut. Elena sat down with a grace that left him breathless. She spoke with a refined, international accent she had spent years perfecting. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for being on time. My time is incredibly expensive," she said, her voice smooth and cold as ice. Julian stammered, his usual bravado failing him. I'm sorry. Have we met? You look incredibly familiar." Elena smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps in another life, Julian. But today, we are here to talk about your survival." Throughout the lunch, Elena watched him squirm. She presented him with a deal that seemed too good to be true, a massive injection of capital in exchange for a significant portion of his family's voting shares. Julian was so blinded by the prospect of saving his reputation that he didn't even notice the fine print. He spent the entire time trying to flirt with her, his old habits of thinking he could charm any woman into submission surfacing once more. "You're a very impressive woman," Julian leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's rare to find someone with your exotic beauty and such a sharp mind. Elena felt a wave of nausea, but kept her mask in place. She remembered him saying she was an eyesore. Now, he was panting like a dog at her feet. She pushed the contract toward him. Sign here, and the first installment will be wired to your account by midnight. Fail to meet the growth markers, however, and the Sterling estate becomes the property of my firm. Do we have a deal? Julian didn't even consult his mother. He grabbed the pen and signed, his hand shaking with a mix of greed and relief. He thought he had just won the lottery. He didn't realize he had just signed the death warrant of his family's legacy. As he stood up to leave, he tried to take her hand, but Elena pulled back, her eyes flashing with a brief, terrifying light. One more thing, Julian, she said as he reached the door. How is your wife, the one you used to speak so highly of? Julian stopped, a look of confusion crossing his face. Oh, her? She ran off years ago. A common girl, couldn't handle the pressure of a high society life. Probably back in some gutter where she belongs. Elena nodded slowly. I see. It's funny how people always end up exactly where they belong, isn't it? Julian laughed, oblivious, and walked out of the room, leaving Elena alone with the signed contract. She looked at his signature, the same signature that had appeared on their marriage certificate, and felt a cold sense of satisfaction. The first phase was complete. The money hit Julian's account at midnight, just as Elena had promised. To the Sterlings, it felt like a miracle from the heavens, but in reality, it was the first payment of a debt they didn't know they owed. The next morning, Julian's mother, Mrs. Sterling, was already planning a gala to celebrate their return to power. She spent thousands of the new funds on silk drapes and imported champagne, oblivious to the fact that every cent was being tracked by Elena's software. Elena sat in her dark office, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't just watching the money, she was watching the family. She had installed discreet surveillance in their home under the guise of a security upgrade included in the partnership deal. She watched as they toasted to their brilliance, mocking the nameless woman who had given them the loan. She's clearly desperate for our prestige, Mrs. Sterling laughed, swirling her wine. They always want what they can't have. Elena's plan moved into its second phase, the isolation. She began to leak confidential reports to Julian's business rivals, suggesting that the Sterling firm was being investigated for money laundering. It wasn't true yet, but in the world of high finance, a rumor is as good as a conviction. Julian's phone began to ring incessantly. Partners who had been with the family for decades suddenly pulled out of deals. The stock price of Sterling Enterprises began to wobble. Julian, panicked, called the only person he thought could help him, the mysterious representative of Ebony and Ivory Holdings. Elena let the phone ring for 3 days before answering. When she finally did, her voice was clipped. Julian, your incompetence is becoming a liability. My investors are nervous. I need to see the family books, in person, at your estate tomorrow. And I want your mother there too. Julian was terrified. He spent the night trying to cook the books, but Elena knew every trick in his arsenal. She had lived in that house. She knew where the physical ledgers were hidden behind the fake library shelves. The next afternoon, she pulled up to the Sterling mansion in a black limousine. As she stepped out, she took a deep breath. The last time she stood on this gravel, she was a broken woman sneaking away in the middle of the night. Now, she was the one holding the keys. She walked up the steps, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, predatory sound. The butler, a man who had once refused to even look her in the eye, opened the door and bowed deeply. "This way, madame," he whispered. Elena almost laughed. Money didn't just buy power, it bought the very respect they had claimed she could never earn. Mrs. Sterling was waiting in the grand drawing room, clutching her pearls so tightly her knuckles were white. Julian stood by the window, sweating despite the air conditioning. When Elena entered, Mrs. Sterling stood up, her eyes narrowing. You're the one? The billionaire's proxy? She squinted, her vanity struggling to reconcile the sophisticated woman before her with the memory of the dark shadow. Elena didn't give her a chance to think. She threw a folder onto the coffee table. The books are a mess, Mrs. Sterling. You've been using company funds to pay for your personal jewelry and the upkeep of this aging museum. That's embezzlement. If my investors see this, they won't just pull the funding, they'll call the authorities. Julian rushed over, his voice cracking. We can fix it. We just need more time. Another loan. Elena sat down in Mrs. Sterling's favorite wingback chair, crossing her legs elegantly. I don't give second chances to people who don't know their place, she said, using the very phrase Mrs. Sterling had used against her 100 times. However, I am prepared to offer a buyout. I take the house, the remaining shares, and the name. You take a small settlement and leave the country. You have 24 hours to decide, Mrs. Sterling let out a shrill laugh. Take our house? This is the Sterling legacy. Who do you think you are? Elena leaned forward, the light hitting her face just right. I am the consequence of your cruelty, Regina. I am the woman who did the cleaning while you called me names. I am the wife your son threw away like a used rag. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in. Mrs. Sterling's glass fell from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. Elena? She whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden icy realization. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Julian looked like he had seen a ghost, his face transitioning from confusion to a sickly shade of gray. Elena? No. That's impossible, he stammered, his eyes darting over her expensive suit and her commanding presence. You were nothing. You were a nobody from a village. You couldn't have. You don't have this kind of power. Elena didn't flinch. She simply watched him, a cold smile playing on her lips. That was your biggest mistake, Julian. You confused my silence for weakness and my patience for stupidity. While you were busy being a Sterling, I was busy becoming the person who would end the Sterlings. Mrs. Sterling grabbed the edge of the table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This is a trick! You've stolen this money! You've deceived us! She shrieked, her voice cracking with the first signs of true panic. Elena stood up slowly, the movement so fluid and predatory that even the security guard at the door shifted uncomfortably. Deception? That's a bold word coming from a woman who forged her husband's will to cut out his legitimate sister. Or perhaps we should talk about the charity foundation you've been using as a personal piggy bank for the last decade. I didn't steal anything, Regina. I earned every cent, and I spent every cent buying up your debt, your secrets, and eventually, your dignity. Julian tried to step toward her, his hands outstretched, in a pathetic attempt at reconciliation. Elena, baby, listen to me. We had a misunderstanding, the things I said. I was under a lot of pressure. My parents, the business. They got in my head. But look at you now. You're magnificent. We can be a power couple. Think about it. With your brains and the Sterling name, we could rule this city. Elena let out a sharp, melodic laugh that chilled Julian to the bone. The Sterling name? Julian, the Sterling name is currently synonymous with bankruptcy and scandal. By tomorrow morning, every major news outlet will have the documents proving your family's systemic fraud. The only ruling you'll be doing is deciding who gets the top bunk in a cell. The reality finally began to sink in. Julian slumped into a chair, the weight of his own hubris finally crushing him. He looked at the contract on the table, the one he had signed so eagerly, and realized he had handed her the keys to his kingdom. Elena walked over to him and leaned down, her voice a lethal whisper near his ear. I remember the night I left. I heard you tell your brother I was just a housekeeper you happened to sleep with. Well, Julian, the housekeeper is finished with the cleaning, and I've decided the first thing to be thrown out is the trash. She straightened her suit jacket and looked at Mrs. Sterling, who was now weeping silently. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises. Take your clothes and your fair-skinned pride. Leave the jewelry it was bought with company money, and the company now belongs to me. As Elena turned to leave, Mrs. Sterling found one last spark of venom. You'll never be one of us. No matter how much money you have, you're still that dark girl from the mud. Elena stopped at the door, but she didn't turn around. You're right, Regina. I'll never be one of you. I'm something much more dangerous. I'm the person who knows exactly what it's like to have nothing, which means I have nothing to lose. You, on the other hand, are about to find out what it's like to be exactly what you feared, irrelevant. Elena walked out of the mansion, the heavy doors closing behind her with a final, echoing thud. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the estate, but for the first time in her life, the shadows didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a victory. The next morning, the city woke up to a financial earthquake. The headlines were relentless. Sterling empire crumbles, secret fraud exposed. Elena sat in her sleek, glass-walled office, sipping black coffee as she watched the news cycles. She had timed the release of the documents with surgical precision. By the time the stock market opened, Julian's shares weren't even worth the paper they were printed on. She watched a live feed from a drone she'd hired, hovering near the Sterling mansion. Tax authorities and forensic auditors were already swarming the property. Julian was seen on the front steps, disheveled and frantic, arguing with a man in a suit, while Mrs. Sterling sat on a suitcase, her face buried in her hands. The Regal family was being evicted by the very system they thought they controlled. Elena didn't feel a rush of joy. Instead, she felt a profound sense of peace. The dark shadow had finally stepped into the sun, and the sun was scorching her enemies. But she wasn't done. Revenge is a dish best served in stages, and she wanted Julian to feel the full weight of his betrayal. She sent a final message to his private phone. "Meet me at the old pier at 6 p.m. If you want a chance to save your mother from prison, you'll be there alone." She knew Julian's one remaining weakness was his mother, not because he loved her, but because she was the only person left who still fed his ego. Julian arrived at the pier 20 minutes early. He looked like a ghost of the man he once was. His designer shirt was stained, and his eyes were bloodshot. When Elena's car pulled up, he ran toward it, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Elena, please!" "The police are at the house. They're talking about years of tax evasion. My mother, she can't go to jail. She's too old, too fragile." Elena stepped out of the car, looking immaculate. She looked at the pier, the same spot where, years ago, Julian had told her she was an embarrassment to be seen with in public. "Fragile?" Elena echoed, her voice cold. "She wasn't too fragile to spend years tearing down my spirit. She wasn't too fragile to call me a peasant every time I breathed the same air as her." Julian fell to his knees, the cold Atlantic wind whipping his hair. "I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want. Just give us the money to pay off the immediate debt. I know you have it." "You took it from us." Elena looked down at him, not with hatred, but with pity. "I didn't take anything that wasn't already rotten, Julian. Your family was a house of cards, built on the backs of people you stepped on. I just blew the wind." She reached into her bag and pulled out a single document. It wasn't a check, it was a confession. "Sign this. Admit to every bribe, every forged signature, and every cent you stole from the workers' pension fund. Do it, and I'll make sure your mother is placed in a private care facility instead of a state prison. She'll have a bed and food, but she'll never see a pearl again." Julian stared at the paper. If he signed it, his career was over. He would be barred from the financial world forever. He would be a pariah. But as he looked at Elena, the woman he had once owned and discarded, he realized he had no choice. She had outplayed him at every turn. He took the pen with trembling fingers and signed his name, effectively erasing his future. Elena took the paper back, blowing on the ink to dry it. "Thank you, Julian. This is for the woman I used to be. The one who cried herself to sleep while you laughed at her." She turned to walk away, but Julian grabbed the hem of her coat. "Wait. What about me? Where am I supposed to go?" Elena didn't even look back. "To the same place you sent me, Julian. To the bottom. Let's see if you can climb out without a name to protect you." As she drove away, Elena watched him in the rearview mirror until he was just a small, broken speck against the gray horizon. She felt a chapter of her life closing a long, painful chapter that had defined her for too long. She had her wealth, she had her freedom, and she had her name back. But more importantly, she had her dignity. The woman who was once told she was too dark and too poor was now the most powerful person in the city, and she hadn't had to sacrifice her soul to get there. She had simply demanded back what was taken from her, with interest. In the weeks following the confrontation at the pier, the city watched in morbid fascination as the Sterling name was scrubbed from every building and charitable foundation. Elena did not hide in the shadows anymore. She bought the Sterling's former flagship office building and renamed it the Phoenix Center, a hub for minority-owned startups and scholarships for women from underprivileged backgrounds. She was no longer just a ghost from the past. She was a titan of the present. But while the public saw a successful businesswoman, Elena was still tying up the final threads of her intricate plan. She knew that a wounded animal like Julian, even when beaten, could still be dangerous if left with a single shred of hope. She received word from her private investigators that Julian had moved into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city he used to call the slums. It was a poetic irony that he was now living in the very conditions he had mocked Elena for escaping. He was attempting to build a case against her, claiming that she had coerced him into signing the confession under duress. Elena anticipated this. She had recorded every second of their meeting at the pier, but she didn't release it to the police yet. She wanted him to exhaust his remaining resources, the last of his hidden cash, and his few remaining loyal friends on a legal battle he could never win. She wanted him to feel the slow, agonizing drain of losing everything twice. Meanwhile, Mrs. Sterling was finding life in the private care facility to be its own kind of purgatory. It was a clean, safe place, but it was devoid of the luxury she craved. There were no servants to bark orders at, no gala invitations to flaunt, and no one cared about her lineage. The other residents saw her as just another lonely old woman with a bitter tongue. Elena visited her once, not out of spite, but to deliver a final message. When Elena walked into the common room, Mrs. Sterling's eyes flared with a mix of rage and terror. "Have you come to gloat?" the older woman hissed, her hands shaking as she clutched a plastic cup of water. Elena sat opposite her, looking radiant and calm. "I've come to give you something, Regina." She handed her a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of the village where Elena grew up, a beautiful, sun-drenched place full of vibrant people and laughter. "You called this place a gutter. You called my people shadows. But while you were building a life on lies and theft, these people were building a life on community and love. I'm buying the land back for them. I'm building a hospital and a school there with the money I took back from your family." Regina looked at the photo and then at Elena, the realization finally hitting her that she had lost more than just money. She had lost her claim to superiority. Back at her office, Elena's assistant entered with a grave expression. "Julian has filed the lawsuit, madame. He's claiming you used illegal surveillance and financial entrapment to ruin him. He's found a lawyer willing to take the case on a contingency basis, someone who hates your rising influence." Elena leaned back in her chair, a cold, calculated glint in her eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had intentionally left a few breadcrumbs for Julian to find, leading him to believe she had a weak spot in her financial records. It was a lure. "Let him proceed," Elena said quietly. "In fact, tell our legal team to expedite the hearing. I want this in a courtroom within the month." Elena knew that a courtroom was the only place where the truth could be immortalized. She didn't just want Julian bankrupt, she wanted him legally branded as a fraud in the eyes of the public record. She began preparing her evidence, not just the financial records, but the years of personal journals she had kept during her marriage. She had documented every insult, every act of emotional abuse, and every time Julian had forced her to sign documents she didn't understand. She was going to turn his own illegal surveillance argument against him by showing that she had been a victim of a domestic prison long before she became his financial executioner. As the trial date approached, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. The story of the Dark Widow returning to claim her throne was a sensation. People were divided. Some saw her as a hero for the marginalized, while the old money elite whispered that she was a dangerous social climber. Elena didn't care about the labels. She knew who she was. She spent her nights in her penthouse, looking out at the city, reflecting on the 36-year-old woman who had once stood on a bridge, wondering if life was worth living. She wished she could tell that version of herself that the fire she was walking through wasn't meant to consume her, but to forge her into something unbreakable. On the eve of the trial, Julian sent her an email. It was a rambling, desperate plea for a settlement. He offered to drop the suit if she gave him $5 million and a modest estate. He even had the audacity to suggest they could start over in a different country where no one knew them. Elena deleted the email without replying. She didn't want his money, and she certainly didn't want his presence. She wanted the world to see the Sterlings for what they were, a hollow monument to a bygone era of arrogance. The stage was set. The players were in position, and the final act of her vengeance was about to begin. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the smell of old wood and nervous sweat. Julian sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for him now, a remnant of his former life that hung loosely on his diminished frame. He tried to maintain an air of wounded dignity, but his eyes kept darting toward the doors. When Elena entered, the room went silent. She wasn't wearing the emerald green of their first meeting or the sharp black of their confrontation. She wore a simple, elegant white suit, the color of new beginnings and cold, hard truth. She didn't look at Julian once. She walked to her seat with the poise of a woman who had already won. Julian's lawyer opened with a dramatic flair, painting a picture of a scorned woman who had used technological witchcraft and financial manipulation to dismantle a historic family. He spoke of predatory business tactics and emotional blackmail, trying to turn the jury against Elena by portraying her as a cold, calculating machine. Julian even took the stand, shedding crocodile tears as he described how his loving wife had disappeared only to return as a corporate shark out for blood. "I loved her," Julian lied, his voice cracking on cue. "I tried to give her everything, but she wanted the world, and she wanted to see me burn." Elena watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. When it was her turn to testify, her lawyer didn't focus on the money at first. Instead, he pulled up a series of digital files. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer began, "you claim you loved your wife. Is this how you show love?" He pressed a button, and a recording filled the room. It was from one of the Sterling's own security cameras, years old. The video showed Julian screaming at Elena because she had forgotten to polish a silver tray correctly. The audio was clear. "You're a stain on this house, Elena. You're lucky I don't send you back to the dirt you came from," the jury gasped. The image of the loving husband shattered instantly. The evidence continued, a relentless barrage of Julian's own cruelty. Elena's lawyer presented the hidden ledgers she had uncovered, showing how Julian had diverted funds meant for employee health care into his own gambling accounts. But the final blow was the confession Julian had signed at the pier. His lawyer tried to argue it was signed under duress, but Elena's team played the full video of that meeting. It showed no weapons, no threats, only Elena standing tall while Julian groveled for money. "I signed it because she was going to tell the truth," Julian shouted from the stand, realizing too late that he had just admitted the confession was accurate. The judge slammed the gavel, but the damage was done. Julian had trapped himself in a web of his own lies. Elena was then called to the stand. She didn't use her time to scream or cry. She spoke calmly about the 3,650 days she had spent in that house, feeling like a ghost. "They didn't just hate me for being poor," she told the court, her voice steady and resonant. "They hated me because my existence reminded them that their prestige was a lie. They needed me to be small so they could feel big. I didn't destroy their empire. I simply stopped holding it up." As the trial drew to a close, it was clear that the tide had turned completely. The jury didn't see a scorned woman. They saw a survivor who had reclaimed her life. Julian's lawyer looked defeated, and Julian himself sat slumped in his chair, staring at his trembling hands. The Sterling secrets were no longer whispers in a dark hallway. They were public record. The dark shadow had brought everything into the blinding light of justice. Elena stepped down from the witness stand and walked past Julian. For the first time, she looked him in the eye. She didn't see a monster anymore. She saw a small, hollow man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. The deliberation was short. The jury found in favor of Elena on every count. Not only was Julian's lawsuit dismissed, but the judge also ordered a formal investigation into the Sterling family's financial crimes based on the evidence presented. Julian was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, pending bail he could no longer afford. As he was being escorted away, he turned to shout one last insult, but the words died in his throat. Elena was already walking away, surrounded by her legal team and supporters, moving toward the bright sunlight streaming through the courthouse doors. She didn't look back. She had a new world to build, and Julian was no longer part of it. After the high-profile victory in court, the city's fascination with Elena reached a fever pitch. However, she didn't spend her time doing victory laps in the media. Instead, she retreated to the quiet sanctuary of her work. The Sterling mansion, now legally hers, stood empty, a hollow shell of a past life. She decided she would never live there. She ordered the heavy, dark furniture to be sold, and the proceeds donated to local shelters. The house itself was to be gutted and transformed into a community center for arts and education. She wanted the very walls that had echoed with insults to now resonate with the laughter of children and the hope of the marginalized. Julian's fall was absolute. Without the Sterling name to shield him, he was just another face in the system. His friends disappeared overnight, and the legal fees from his failed lawsuit had swallowed the last of his hidden reserves. He was eventually convicted on several counts of financial fraud and sentenced to a significant term. The news showed him being led into a transport van, his face hidden behind his hands. Elena watched the broadcast once, then turned off the television. She realized that the fire of revenge, which had fueled her for years, had finally burned itself out. In its place was a cool, steady light, the light of a woman who was finally at peace with herself. One afternoon, Elena received a letter from the care facility where Mrs. Sterling was staying. The old woman's health was failing rapidly. Despite everything, Elena decided to go. When she arrived, the room was small and smelled of antiseptic. Regina lay in the bed, looking frail and diminished. The arrogance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a vacant stare. When she saw Elena, she didn't scream or curse. She simply reached out a trembling hand. You were the only one who stayed," she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. Elena realized that in their world of vanity, loyalty was a foreign concept. Julian hadn't visited his mother once since his downfall. Elena sat by the bed for an hour. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about the money or the scandals. Elena simply sat there, a witness to the end of an era. She realized that Regina was a victim of her own upbringing, a woman who had been taught that her value was tied to her skin color and her bank balance. It was a cycle of misery that Elena had finally broken. When Elena left the facility, she felt a profound sense of closure. She had not only defeated her enemies, she had outlived their hatred. She walked out into the cool evening air, feeling lighter than she had in decades. Her business empire continued to grow, but its focus shifted. She became a silent patron for women who, like her, had been discarded by society. She funded legal aid for victims of domestic abuse and created grants for women of color in the tech and finance sectors. She became known as the architect of second chances. Her life was no longer about what had been taken from her, but about what she could give back. She had turned the Dark Shadow nickname into a symbol of quiet, unstoppable power. She lived in a modest but beautiful apartment overlooking the river, surrounded by books and art that reflected her own journey. She often thought back to that night she stood on the bridge at 36, ready to give up. She thought about the courage it took to walk away from everything she knew, even when everything was a prison. She realized that her greatest act of revenge wasn't the lawsuit or the financial takeover. It was the fact that she had survived and thrived. She had built a life that was entirely her own, free from the expectations and the cruelty of the Sterling name. She was Elena, a woman of depth, intelligence, and grace. The poverty of her past had become the wealth of her character. As the years passed, the story of the Sterling family became a cautionary tale, a footnote in the history of the city. But the story of Elena became a legend. She was the woman who turned silence into a weapon and shadows into a crown. She never remarried. She found that her own company was the most fulfilling partnership she had ever known. She traveled the world, visiting the places she had only dreamed of while she was scrubbing floors. She returned to her village often, not as a savior, but as a daughter, sitting under the ancient trees and listening to the stories of her ancestors. The final phase of her plan wasn't about destruction, it was about legacy. She made sure that no one would ever be treated the way she was in that city again. She used her influence to push for fair housing and labor laws, ensuring that a person's worth would never again be measured by the fairness of their skin or the depth of their pockets. She had turned her pain into a platform and her betrayal into a bridge for others to cross. Elena had finally found the one thing the Sterlings could never buy: a truly meaningful life. As the dust of the legal battle settled, Elena found herself standing at the precipice of a brand new existence. The world knew her name, but they didn't know her heart. While the media continued to speculate about her mysterious transformation, Elena focused on the quiet work of dismantling the invisible barriers she had spent a lifetime facing. She realized that while she had destroyed the Sterling family, the system that allowed people like them to thrive still existed. She decided to use her vast resources to create a whistleblower fund, a legal and financial safety net for those who worked within corrupt organizations and were afraid to speak out. She wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure years of silence and abuse just to survive. Her daily life became a rhythmic balance of corporate strategy and personal healing. She took up hobbies she had been told were above her station: painting, horseback riding, and collecting rare books on African history. She found that she had a natural talent for landscapes, often painting the rolling hills of her childhood village with a vibrancy that captured the soul of the land. It was a form of meditation, a way to reclaim the colors of her life that the Sterlings had tried to wash away. She was no longer running from the dark shadow. She was using it as the depth in her art. In the corporate world, she was respected and feared, but she led with an empathy that confused her rivals. She didn't believe in the crush your enemies mentality of the old guard. Instead, she practiced a radical form of transparency. Every employee at her firm knew they had a voice, regardless of their position. She remembered the faces of the staff at the Sterling mansion, the invisible people who saw everything but were never heard. She made it her mission to see them. She often spent her lunch hours in the employee lounge, listening to the stories of the janitors and the clerks, finding more wisdom in their words than she ever had in a boardroom. One evening, while walking through the city park she had helped renovate, she saw a man sitting on a bench, staring blankly at the pond. It was Julian's brother, the one who had laughed along with him that fateful night. He looked tired, his expensive clothes replaced by a worn jacket. He recognized her and stood up, but there was no malice in his eyes, only a profound, hollow shame. "I lost everything too, Elena," he said quietly. "When the firm went down, I realized I didn't actually know how to do anything. I was just a name." Elena looked at him, and for a moment, she felt the old sting of his laughter. But then, it vanished. "The name was a cage, Marcus," she replied. "Now you have the chance to find out who you are without it." She didn't offer him money, but she gave him the name of a vocational school she funded. It was the ultimate mercy, the chance to work for his own life. This encounter reinforced her belief that her journey was complete. She had not only survived the Sterlings, she had outgrown them. She began to write her memoirs, not to settle scores, but to provide a roadmap for others. She titled it The Architect of Light, a nod to the fact that even in the darkest shadows, one can find the materials to build a sun. The book became an overnight sensation, translated into dozens of languages. Letters began to pour in from all over the world, from women in small villages and men in corporate skyscrapers, all of them moved by her resilience. She had become a global symbol of the fact that your beginning does not define your end. As her 40th birthday approached, Elena decided to throw a party, but not the kind the Sterlings would have understood. It was a celebration held in the community center she had built on the site of the old mansion. There were no VIP lists or dress codes. There were local musicians, street food vendors, and families from every corner of the city. Elena stood in the center of the hall, wearing a dress that reflected the colors of a sunset, surrounded by people who loved her for who she was, not what she owned. She looked at the spot where the dining table used to stand, the place where she had once felt so small, and she smiled. The shadows were gone. That night, as she stood on the balcony of her apartment, she felt a sense of immense gratitude. The 36-year-old woman who had left in the middle of the night had been a seed planted in the dark, cold earth. The 4 years since had been the struggle toward the surface, and now she was finally in full bloom. She realized that the revenge she had sought was never really about the Sterlings. It was about the reclamation of herself. She had taken back her time, her beauty, and her power. She was no longer a character in someone else's cruel story. She was the author of her own masterpiece. The stars above the city seemed brighter than ever. Elena closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the cool air. She was at peace. The journey from the village to the mansion, from the gutter to the boardroom, and finally from the past to the present, was over. She had nothing left to prove and everything left to live for. She was Elena, dark, beautiful, wealthy, and most importantly, free. The world was wide open, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was ready for whatever the next chapter would bring, knowing she had the strength to face any storm and the wisdom to enjoy any sun. In the final year of her grand plan, Elena returned to the place where it all began, her home village. But she didn't return as a stranger or a ghost. She returned as the woman who had turned the world's cruelty into a foundation for change. The village had transformed. The clinic she funded was saving lives, and the school was filled with young girls who looked just like her, eyes bright with the knowledge that their potential was limitless. As she sat on the porch of the house she had built for her mother, she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. She realized that her life had come full circle. The poverty that the Sterlings had mocked was never a lack of money. It was the Sterlings who were poor, poor in spirit, poor in love, and poor in humanity. Elena was the wealthiest person she knew, not because of her bank account, but because she could look in the mirror and see a woman of integrity. The news eventually reached her that Julian had been released on early parole, but he was a broken man. He was working a menial job at a warehouse, the kind of manual labor he once looked down upon with such disgust. He lived in a tiny room, and his name, once a key to every door in the city, was now a mark of shame. He had reached out to Elena one last time, asking for a loan to start a small business. She didn't send money. Instead, she sent him a copy of her book with a single sentence written on the inside cover. "Value is earned through character, not inherited through blood." It was the final lesson she had to teach him. Whether he learned it or not was no longer her concern. She had deleted his number, wiped his memory from her daily thoughts, and moved forward into a future that was blindingly bright. Regina Sterling passed away shortly after Julian's release. Elena attended the funeral from a distance, standing under a black umbrella in the rain. She was the only one there who wasn't a paid official or a distant relative looking for a scrap of an inheritance that didn't exist. As the soil was laid to rest, Elena felt a final cord snap. The cycle of the dark shadow and the white queen was over. There was only the earth, returning to the earth. She walked back to her car, feeling a strange sense of gratitude for the pain she had endured. It had been the coal that created the diamond. She drove back to the city, ready to sign the final papers that would turn her company into a worker-owned cooperative. She had achieved everything she set out to do, and now she wanted to enjoy the simple pleasures of a life well lived. Elena's story became a beacon of hope for millions. She wasn't just a woman who got rich. She was a woman who got even by being better. She proved that the best revenge is not just living well, but living with a purpose that outshines the darkness of your past. She spent her later years traveling, mentoring, and simply being present. She found love again, not the suffocating, conditional love she had known with Julian, but a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values with a man who saw her skin as a map of her strength and her soul as a masterpiece. She had reached the summit of her life, and the view was breathtaking. Elena, the woman who was once told she was nothing, had become everything. Her legacy was not in the buildings that bore her name, but in the lives of the people she had empowered. Every time a young girl from a poor background stood up for herself, every time a worker spoke out against injustice, and every time a woman walked away from a toxic situation with her head held high, Elena's spirit was there. She had rewritten the narrative of the dark, poor girl and turned it into an epic of triumph. As she looked out over the city she had conquered and then healed, she whispered a final thank you to the universe. She was 40 years old. She was alone by choice, but never lonely. And she was finally, irrevocably free. The story of the Sterling family was over, but the era of Elena had only just begun. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of resilience and justice here on Dr. Harmony. If Elena's story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story of transformation. Until next time, stay strong and keep shining your light.